Thank you for your time. My name is Baytullah, and this is Shooting from the Hip. How you doing, Slim?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for asking. So I'd like to start. We'll just quickly race through this disclaimer. I just want to say I really appreciate you being here. Really, it means a lot to that my madness. I can share it with all of you. So please keep in mind that what we are doing here on the channel is we explore human ideas, philosophies, and noteworthy information. This exploration is us thinking aloud and a thought exercise, jumping in and out of ideas and examining and re-examining them. You will find we're prone to using adult language and expressing opinions. So just bear that in mind. And keeping with that, you shouldn't believe anything we say. We're not experts of any kind. We're just having fun with these ideas, philosophies, and information in the hopes that you will find it fun and interesting. We encourage you to invest time in searching out these subjects and come to your own conclusions. Now on with the shit show. So on today's episode of Shooting from the Hip, we are going to, it started as, my fascination with MK Ultra started long ago when I first heard about it, but there was a book recently written that was really super interesting, deep dive, and a couple of decades of research went into this book, and it really is very fascinating. The book's title is Chaos: Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s. So it's a 2019 nonfiction book. It was written by Tom O'Neill with Dan Piepenbring, right? So he supported Tom in the work. Now, why is that super interesting? Well, considering that Quentin Tarantino in the last couple of years actually focused on this very same time period in his movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. So, did you see that?
Yeah, excellent movie.
Yeah. Okay.
Little disturbing.
Okay. But he actually, it was his interpretation of those events in an alternate reality with Charles Manson. Now, why is that significant? And how does that relate to MK Ultra? This is what Tom O'Neill explored within his book. Now, I'm more fascinated with the implications of MK Ultra and what it actually is. And bearing in mind, there's not a ton of evidence, but what there is for evidence, it's very damning. We'll never know what the real content of what they did, because that part they were smart enough to get rid of. And I'm going to say, I'll start right from the opening. I'll start by saying they probably the content of all their objectives and all the research and experimentation were probably crimes against humanity, at the very least crimes against good conscience, and when you think of the depths of the kind of stuff which we're going to explore, you'll find it. I'm going to use the word that you used. You'll find it disturbing, and that it went on for as long as it did will be a bit unsettling, because it's something they engaged in for close to 30 years. Right.
Supposedly, there's still similar projects going on.
Well, this is just wild speculation. So, because we can't know with any certainty, but all that information that they destroyed, I would go so far as to say that I wouldn't be surprised if some of it fell in the hands of more private interests, who could then, because it would. Just to be on the fair side, we'll start right at the beginning. So. MK Ultra was the CIA project. So for any of you who are watching who don't know what that is, that's a Central Intelligence Agency. So intelligence communities, they're basically information gathering units. Virtually every country has some form of it. In the U.S., they were the ones that were originally the driving force behind MK Ultra, right? So MK Ultra, just because you're kind of curious of where they came up with the name MK Ultra, it came from just after World War II, their intelligence gathering, and they had a branch of the military that was referred to as the Technical Service Staff. And the word ultra was the most secret classification of the World War II intelligence. And the MK is a combination of the diagram. It was indicating the sponsorship of this technical service staff, which was referred to as the TSS. Okay, so MK Ultra was a government program run by the Central Intelligence Agency. Originally started something called Bluebird in 1948 and 49. So it's just post World War II. And it eventually morphed into something called Artichoke, and in 1952 then it became MK Ultra. So the slow evolution kind of or change in name matches like the objective. So in 48-49, when it was Artichoke, or sorry, Bluebird rather, they were trying to figure out how they could make soldiers more resistant to torture, so that they wouldn't reveal vital information, right? And then as a result of like pursuing that, I think they made discoveries that kind of changed the objective, because and the discoveries had to do with around psyche and the human psyche, because you know that means within Bluebird they were exploring methods of torture, like to try and break somebody's will to resist, right? So they might have made some very interesting discoveries that would have later then inform and change the objectives to the study, so that it encouraged further study and then change what they were attempting to do. And I don't mean to be vague, but now I'll be really direct. So it was a mind control programming by the time it became MK Ultra. So that evolution to 1952 from 1948. So that basically that 4 years was the evolution from trying to discover a way to make people more resistant to torture, to now out and out mind control and brainwashing programs. They were trying to learn how to control people's behavior without their knowledge, and it was exposed in the Senate and congressional hearings in the 1970s. There was no widespread awareness of it up until about 1974, when it became public information, because it became part of, because it was on the media and stuff, right? Because of the Senate and congressional hearings that were being launched, right? When Seymour Hersch, the New York Times reporter, reported on the front page of the paper. So it was 1974. So then suddenly, like, now everybody knows that this is a thing. So their main objective was to commit to create what they called a hypno-programmed assassin, right? So and these would be, for those of you who don't know what that means, they're trying to basically essentially create people who would kill on command. And the more popular term is known as a Manchurian Candidate, which was a fictional book and a number of movies produced in Hollywood, right? This idea that through the use of drugs and hypnotism and other techniques, that they could create agents whose objective would be to unknowingly act and commit murders against their own moral code and have no memory of the programming and be amnesiac to the act and after the fact. So when they say, I have no idea what you're talking about, it was true. It's not a matter of perspective. They weren't lying. They just had zero recollection of it, right? So because as far as their psyche is concerned, or their identity, they didn't do anything, right? So that was their main goal, and that's what eventually became their main goal. And so it's not like they were centralized in a single lab. Their work was spread out throughout actually universities, and there were universities in Canada that were paid handsomely to participate in the research, right? So it wasn't limited to the U.S., right? So and again, it was because it was probably because of what they discovered, right? Which we'll get to in a moment. So their main goal was not just to create assassins, but couriers who would forget the information that they had. So they they'd go meet with somebody, give them all this information, and then if they got caught, they wouldn't be able to recall that information because it wasn't it wasn't accessible to their current identity or to the main identity, an identity that didn't know that there was a secondary identity that would be the carrier of the information.
It's almost like they're putting in multiple personalities within this person. But
Okay.
that personality has its own traits completely.
Right. So they create mnemonic couriers, people who don't even know that they're a courier, because it's another identity that's been supplanted into their psyche, and their main identity has no awareness of the secondary psyche. Now that if that's not mind-blowing science fiction stuff, then what is? Right? Like, so here it is. It's reality now. And again, we're gonna. There's so much of it that we don't know what they did, but we do know that it did exist, and it did, and we know what their objectives were, and we know what they were trying to do. But they were smart enough to make sure that there was no way anybody could hang that over their heads, which again we'll explore too when we get to that section. Okay, so their idea was basically to be able to use their human assets in a novel, innovative way, so that they wouldn't have to fear any kind of reprisal, capture. It's better than a guy who with a cyanide capsule who kill himself before reveal. He just simply doesn't know. You torture him to no end, and it's not going to produce any kind of result. He'll just answer, I don't know, because he genuinely does not know, right? So Roger Smith was a super, okay, so now we're going to kind of dovetail this into why is Charles Manson even relevant to any of this, right? So Roger Smith was supervising Charles Manson when he became exactly what MKUltra programmed. He had been trying to create and do, and at that point, it had been around 15, 17 years when it was exposed in the 70s. So in the hearings, at the first Rockefeller Commission hearing and the church hearings. And then finally Senator Ted Kennedy and Daniel K. Inouye, who is from Hawaii, held hearings the CIA admitted that they had done. No one would say exactly what they did. All the records had been destroyed. So they confessed, like once they were caught red-handed, they confessed that they were doing it, but there was no content for them to disclose because it was all destroyed. They were that smart. So and remember Charles Manson, I don't know how much you know about Charles Manson. He completely denied and never killed anybody and never told anybody to kill anyone. And yet it was his own followers who the Tate LaBianca murders, so that they were participants in. But he swore up and down, right up until his death, that I didn't kill nobody and tell anyone to kill anyone. So if everything that we talked about so far is true, technically that's true, right? So the two people in charge were Richard Helms, who was the director of the CIA in the 60s at that time. So when the threat of them being exposed, so it was probably because I'm assuming that directors stay on for extended periods of time. It was probably him that ordered the destruction of all the evidence, and a supervillain by the name of Dr. Sidney Gottlieb. Like, what more supervillain name could you possibly want? Dr. Evil, a mad scientist who had supervised all that they had done. So their safe houses in San Francisco, New York, Los Angeles. Gottlieb was the mind, not just the mind behind it, but he was one of the chief individuals behind the program, right? So, and you're going safe houses. Well, how they would experiment on average citizens. So in San Francisco at the time, it was the hippie movement was big. We're talking about the 60s, right? And Haight-Ashbury was a district of San Francisco, California, named after the intersection of Haight and Ashbury streets. And it was also called the Haight and the Upper Haight. The neighborhood is known as one of the main centers of counterculture of the 60s. where they would experiment on people, and they were lured into these apartment houses that either looked like brothels or hippie communes, right? And the people who were working at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, which was a front for the CIA program, was run by another Smith, which makes it a little confusing. But Dr. David Smith, who founded it, had given an office to a scientist named Louis Jolyon West, who was identified in the hearings in the 1970s as the top MK Ultra researcher. So this guy's story is super interesting. So we're just going to delve into him a little bit. So this Louis Jolyon West, he died in 1999. Was an American psychiatrist involved in the public sphere. And in 1954, at the age of 29, with no previous tenure, track appointment, no real work experience, he became the full professor and chair of psychiatry at the University of Oklahoma College of Medicine. Right?
Huh.
So he was handpicked, and it was probably because. It might be presumptuous of me to say, but it might be because he maybe lacked moral fiber, and they were like, that's exactly what we need. So when the CIA were looking for academics, they were looking for people with loose morals so that they would be able to help them meet objectives. Remember, the objective was to create people who would be unknowing and unwitting assassins. So you're talking about like that's, what kind of researcher would it take to be able to do such a thing? And so it takes somebody like who's, like I say, very loose morals, right, unethical, right, that doesn't have any kind of restrictions. So maybe that's why he was cherry picked.
He probably had just the great idea of having people who have these morals act out these crimes and then not be able to relate to the, what happened afterwards. That's definitely evil genius type plot.
Yeah,
and very, very much that guy's thinking.
Yeah, man, this guy's a total comic book supervillain, right? Like makes them all look kind of like pale. So from 1969 to 89, he served as the chair of psychiatry at the University of California, Los Angeles School of Medicine, and the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute. So he had his hands in like the best Ivy League places for the purposes of being able to conduct this research. Now, how much these schools were aware of it, they probably had no idea what was going on in these departments beyond like what the departments were supposed to be doing in a real benign kind of way. But here this guy was doing research on how to basically create, assassins, right? So, West's work on brainwashing techniques allowed him to exonerate U.S. servicemen under suspicion of treason for making false confessions during the Korean War era. So there were probably guys who were tortured and then who confessed to are you aware of the Korean War? North Korea and South Korea were at war, in the U.S. and it was a proxy war for the U.S. and at that time the USSR.
I'm not very familiar.
Okay, so all right, so when they captured some of the enemy, when I say they, I mean the communists, the northern Chinese, or the northern Koreans, with the support of China, or sorry, I'll try that again, with the support of the USSR. What they would do is they capture American servicemen and they torture them until they confess to doing like committing war crimes, right? So what he would do is this West guy, he would deal with these guys, and he would start using these brainwashing techniques to exonerate these servicemen from like saying that like that they had been brainwashed or tortured to make these confessions and stuff, so that the confessions were completely erroneous and bogus and they were under duress, right? So they shouldn't be believed and that sort of thing. So makes you wonder if then they started looking at these servicemen who came back from the Korean War and going, well, they're perfect to test subjects, right? Like, right? So again, I should be clear that there's no proof that he actually did this, but he was there. So if there was, and if this is what he was already doing, or what he was, his position was with the CIA, wouldn't these be the prime kind of people for them to experiment with? And the answer is, well, probably yes, right? But whether or not he actually did, can't say with any real certainty. But there's a strong likelihood that it could happen. So, so this brought him, and so when he was exonerating these guys, that's what got the CIA's attention, because he had pioneered research in the use and abuse of LSD. So they were like, so that's probably what allowed for him to accelerate his career in an unnatural way, right? Because he was holding positions that would probably go to people who'd been in the field for at least a couple decades, not a guy coming straight out of school, right? So, okay. Now, having said that, West was also active in studying the creation and management of cults and anti-death penalty activism. Along with his friend Charlton Heston, he supported the civil rights movement and frequently participating in sit-ins and rallies. So this was a guy who was so devious that this is what he was doing for his work, was working for the CIA to create these unwitting assassins, while presenting socially relevant and social conscious individual, that he was an active participant in the community and non-war and all this stuff. So what a great way to hide your intentions, right?
Yeah, isn't that like almost literally, if not literally, an insurgent?
Well, yeah. Yeah. So to me, it just seems super fascinating, right? And so and remember, it took forever for them to figure this out, that this was what was going on. So, and again, we'll get to that more in a moment. So he was an academic coming out of the military. He denied ever being involved in MK Ultra. So this, because in the 70s, when those commissions were going on to try and determine what was happening, he just out and out denied that they had anything to do with it. West had been at the same place that Manson was in Haight in the summer. That he was there. So you can't prove that he was that he was using him as a research subject. But because of their close proximity and because their timetables overlapped and in the right place, it's not too far of a stretch to think that maybe that's maybe what Charles Manson was. He was a successful experiment, right? And why do I say that? Again, we'll reveal that momentarily. So, West was interviewed, and in that time, one of the things that he did was he studied celebrity stalkers, like people who were obsessed with stars and then would kill them or try to kill them. He was an expert in violence, hypnotism, brainwashing. He was a chair of a psychiatric department of UCLA at that point. And he was dead when his name came up in the Manson story. So by the time all that stuff started, like more and more information, he had passed on. So, and there had been allegations that he hadn't been involved in MK Ultra, which he always denied. He was never prosecuted, and he was never even investigated. He went to his grave threatening to sue anyone, to take legal action against anyone who might have said anything other than or contrary to the fact that that his denial of being part of MK Ultra. And then we'll end up discovering that not only was he was one of the chief instigators, right? So he again another perfect supervillain with not exactly a perfect supervillain name, right? So Tom O'Neill, from the writer, he got access to all these files left at UCLA, and this is how we know, right? This is how we know, like the depth and length of the program, but we don't know the content of what they exactly did. And it was because of all the investigation, or all the research he did in stored files in UCLA. So they'd have, can you imagine, just warehouses worth of stored files of like transcripts and financial records, all that stuff. So he poured through all that stuff. It took 2 to 3 months for him pouring through the paperwork. He spent an entire summer looking for a needle in the haystack, and his intuition bore him out right, because he eventually found a correspondence between Joylyn West and Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the doctor who ran MK Ultra from the beginning in 1953. So the evil supervillain, and then the modern day supervillain, right? So Gottlieb, right? Jesus, man, like you can't make that stuff up. Like said, sounds like Third Reich kind of something you'd expect out of Nazi Germany. Sorry. So that was the evidence. He found the correspondence between the two of them, where they talked about the research that they were doing, not like specific details, it's just in more broader strokes at what they needed to do, the direction the research needed to go in. So that's damning. But he's dead by that time. The guy died. So there was no way of getting him to at least give some kind of like a deathbed confession to the extent of what they were doing and stuff.
It's strange that in order to find a deep state, or dark state, whatever you'd like to call it, how do you do it? Like, really, this guy had to pour over files for 3 months, just happened to find the transcript that works. But you look at this era, let's say the 60s, a lot of covert things supposedly happened.
Yeah, but it's also been ongoing. I think it's foolish to think that because of the time that this occurred in, that
Right.
somehow, when they said it all ended, I think that's kind of naive to think that it just all came to a close. I think, particularly if the information that they gathered or discovered had some kind of practical application. So then.
And why would they continue the research for 30 years if it was...
Right, so implementing it would become, like you would think, would become something that they would be concerned with and would want to do.
Are you saying testing on citizens?
Oh, no. I'm like that maybe that the success of what they were doing allowed for them to be able to create like sleeper agents. And now you can insert them literally anywhere. So on the surface, they're a particular person. And lying beneath that identity, there's another identity that, under the right trigger, will you'd have to use something to trigger that identity to become the surface identity, and then it would carry out a function, a pre-planned function. So if you wanted, so this is how weird it could get. So if you wanted to, you could infiltrate not just other countries, corporations, other organizations, and you would do it by capturing somebody who's already a member of these different countries, like so high-ranking official, or somebody who's like a head of some kind of corporation, or
the reach is amazing.
What it allow for them to do is you could take an individual who's already in that position, implant a new identity, and then that identity have a trigger, so that when you needed that identity to go active, you would just use the trigger, and then they'd go active, do what they're supposed to do, and then they would again provide another trigger that would now cause that hidden identity to go back into remission, to hide again until they required it to do more work. So it's the kind of thing you go like, oh my God, that's insane. But the thought of it is like, you're like, that really is science fiction. It's like Jason Bourne for real.
The practical application, you could just have one or a few people on a council, in every council, just so much control that way.
Right.
The application sounds amazing.
Right. So go figure. It sounds like supervillains running the world, right? And this is how they do it. They do it by brainwashing the members who genuinely are in those positions because they want to do the work, or for what doesn't matter what their motivation is. And then you don't have to worry about how corruptible they are. You just supplant a personality that will do the job, the very specific job that you want, and they'll be completely oblivious to the fact that function is that even exists in them. And worse, they'll treat it like, oh, come on, it's just science fiction, comic books, it's not real, right? But yet here,
it's been real. It's been shown that stuff.
well,
That's been
so
at
we
least
know,
paid for.
so we know that they've been doing it. We just don't know specific details of what they did, right? Which is even more scary because they were smart enough to destroy it, because if any of those details came to light, they'd all be in the hurt locker. They'd all be held to account, right? That's what the Nuremberg trials were for. How many Nazis did they hang? Did they just out and out, like, you're done, right? So imagine, and this is like in the mainstream, and everybody's heard of the CIA. I don't think there's many people in the West who haven't. Right? They're part of, like, think of how many movies they show up in, like, I'm an agent of the CIA, right? Like, so.
Yeah, it would be hilarious to find out how many people are connected to these, CIA agents, because of the number of scandals that are out there. Probability is there's going to be at least a few.
Well, again, it's just speculation, but the safe bet is that if they could do it, it probably would. Right?
I would, if I was that person.
Well, I'm just saying, particularly if they have an agenda, it meets the needs of the agenda. So that's why they would do it, right? Because they have a particular requirement, and it's a way to facilitate that. So it just becomes a method to get what they want. So let's see here. Okay, so and so part of the correspondence between them, they were talking about the experiments they were conducting on people without their knowledge, because remember, the key is to have them amnesiacs, right? So that they don't recall anything that's happened after they're activated. So that part of their programming or the brainwashing, right? Everything he had been accused of and or denied, he did. So this West guy, remember, everything, like, so anything where his name became, and he was like, no, emphatically, no, I never did anything like that. He did. He freaking lied through his teeth to protect his image, or to protect the lifestyle he'd become accustomed to, right? Not only did he do it, he created the blueprint for the whole program with Gottlieb. So the two of them were the absolute masterminds, this Joylin West and Dr. Sidney Gottlieb. These two guys were the ones who worked out the minutiae, the details. That means that they had access to all the research, right? Because they need all that research and have to pour through the research to make conclusions, and then to be able to and then find which methods were more effective versus other methods, and that would mean testing. And remember, it's unknowing, unwitting experiments, right? So these research programs, they all merged at the Haight-Ashbury, at that clinic where Manson came out of, right? And Manson conducted, and think about it, he denied to his dying day that he had anything to do with it. Perfect MK Ultra. Isn't that what they were trying to create? I'm not saying that he did, but it just seems to me that, like, it's an easy connection to make. That doesn't mean that that's evidence that he did, but it just seems super interesting, the synchronicity, that kind of timing. You go, it's super suspicious, right? So, and because it's suspicious, then maybe it's not inappropriate to read into it that maybe he was a very public. It was a very public asset. And for them, it probably validated all the research. Imagine being able to brag, West. So this is West and Gottlieb bragging to the people they answered to in the CIA. Look, he's on TV, and he has no idea. He's denying it up and down, because as far as he's concerned, he never did anything. I never killed. I believe is what he said. He never killed anyone, and he never told anyone to kill anyone. Right, but the reality is that, the Tate LaBianca murders were committed by him and his disciples, rather, like the actual physical murders themselves. So now I just want to briefly comment on Charles Miles Manson. So he was born in November 12th, 1934, and he died November 19th, 2017. So not that long ago, and he spent the majority of his life in prison, right? So he was an American criminal and musician who led the Manson family, a cult based in California in the late 60s. Some of the members committed a series of 9 murders at 4 locations in July and August in 69. In 1971, Manson was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder for the deaths of 7 people, including the film actress Sharon Tate. The prosecution contended that while Manson never directly ordered the murders, his ideology constituted an overt act of conspiracy. So before the murders, Manson had spent more than half of his life in correctional institutions, right? So he's a perfect candidate for their program. While gathering his cult following, Manson was a singer-songwriter on the fringe of Los Angeles music industry. Chiefly through a chance association with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. Can you imagine that? The Beach Boys. Who introduced Manson to record producer Tyler Melcher. And in 1968, the Beach Boys recorded Manson's song Cease to Exist, renamed Never Learn Not to Love, as a single B-side, but without a credit to Manson. Afterward, Manson attempted to secure a record contract through Melcher, but was unsuccessful. Manson would often talk about the Beatles, including their 1968 album, 1968, according to District Attorney Vincent, I can't pronounce this guy's name, Buglicio. Manson felt guided by his interpretation of the Beatles' lyrics and adopted the term helter-skelter to describe an impending apocalyptic race war. During his trial, they argued that Manson intended to incite a race war, although Manson and others disputed this. Contemporary interviews and trial witness testimony insisted that the Tate LaBianca murders were copycat crimes intended to exonerate Manson's friends. So Manson himself denied having instructed anyone, so like I said, full denial, a murder of anyone. And so Manson's notoriety was an emblem for insanity and violence and the macabre, and a macabre influence in pop culture, right? Because
would you associate that with the Beach Boys and Beatles regularly?
No, nobody would. But it was weird. Again, it was because of the location, Los Angeles at the time. The Beatles were an incredibly popular musical group at that time. He was an aspiring musician. It's like the perfect storm, right? That it created this super bizarre pop culture influence that was something that came out of something really disturbing. Like, 9 people were killed, right? So and for no apparent reason. You can almost understand when someone's motivated because it becomes a solution to like problems. I don't want to say that it's understandable, but you see the reasoning that would allow for them to do it, but there was no reasoning. These were just random acts of freaking violence, right? So recording his songs performed by Manson, they were released commercially. So he did have like some commercial exposure or stuff, but it's just, again, it just never took, right? But he had such an influence on the counterculture or pop culture at that time. But that was the more dark, macabre side of everything, right? So there was another project associated with MK Ultra, and it was called Project Midnight Climax. And so these were safe houses in San Francisco there were operations carried out by the CIA, which it was a sub-project of MK Ultra and the mind control research. It was initially established in 1954 by Sidney Gottlieb and placed under the direction of Federal Bureau of Narcotics in Boston, Massachusetts, with the federal narcotics agents and CIA consultants. So, and George Hunter White, under the pseudonym of Morgan Hall, would be the guys overseeing this. So this Project Midnight, Dr. Gottlieb was a chemist who was the chief of the chemical division of the technical services staff of the CIA. Under the Cold War and fears of Soviet Union and China, Gottlieb felt inspired to investigate methods of mind control. Gottlieb based his plan for Project MK Ultra and Operations Climax method research under Project Artichoke. So, unlike Project Artichoke, Operation Midnight Climax gave Gottlieb permission to test drugs on unknowing citizens. So, and this is why they would use these brothels, right? Because what they would do is they'd have their field agents watching over these, and then in the brothels they would lure Johns into the brothels, and then they dose them with LSD and then study them, right? So they would use the working girls to be able to lure them in, and then the working girl would excuse themselves, and then they'd either dose them with an aerosol sprays or spiked drink or some other method to get the LSD into them, and then they would watch. So the prostitutes would get them in there, and then go to the bathroom, and then they'd spend their time observing how these people would respond. Now, there's not a lot of records. They only know that they were doing it, but the specifics of what went on, like what they observed, we don't know. We only know that that's what they were doing, and he had the okay. Remember, Gottlieb had the okay to do that, right? So, and it all led into projects within projects, but it was all under the umbrella of MK Ultra, right?
I can't help to think of other situations that I might want to connect this to, but it's really damning to hear this.
Well, but and again, I'm always surprised by how surprised people are when they hear this stuff, because they just I think I think people could be forgiven for having like a real sterile view of reality, because they just presume that everything's like transparent and things are honest and upfront. And somebody reminded me recently that the majority of people are really good, decent people. They're not. Right, they really are, but it's not the majority who's the ones who cause the problems. It's that minority that they're malicious, malcontents, who just like to see other people suffer. What was that quote from that Batman movie? There's some people just like want to see the world burn.
Yep.
Yeah. So I would thank you, Christopher Nolan, by the way. So to me, I'm not surprised by any of this, but I find it surprising when other people sit there and go, that can't be real, or I'm like, I'm afraid that it is, and we're only scratching the tip of the iceberg. We have no idea how large this iceberg is, and it's largely because anything that could have alluded to it was destroyed, so that we would never find out.
I can't help but to bring up how some things are misrepresented nowadays, even when there's clear evidence that people are, beating around the bush. Like, I don't want to bring into specifics.
Well, yeah. Let's just keep it focused on the material at hand, right? So you can see. I would just like to say, in conjunction with what you just said, that you can see that if this is the kind of thing that was going on like 50, 60 years ago, well, the safe bet is it's probably still, to a degree, greater or lesser, things like this are still going on today. How much? Who could say, right? And those who can say, they'll never say. They'll never come clean about this stuff. Why would they? Think about what this Joylin West, what he did. He went so far to create such a public persona that he was like all about the community, or the sit-ins at war, anti-war rallies, and all this stuff, and promoting this, this real wholesome kind of, good. I'm a good man, rubbing elbows with celebrities. Somebody to aspire to be like, denied any kind of association with it, and then caught red-handed, posthumously. So you can't do nothing about it because he's already dead. Son of a bitch. Sorry, but it's hard for me to be sympathetic, right? Right. So somebody like that, he very willfully used other people. So remember, we've often said this: you do not exploit other people. This is the ultimate expression of this. It's the most perverse and most extreme expression of that very idea that you absolutely do not exploit other people to your own ends. And yet here it is, and with oversight from from organizations that get their money from the government that gets its money from taxes. So the people, the average person, the people who they experimented on in a greater or lesser extent, their taxes went towards their own exploitation. That's horrible. That's sad. So again, supervillains are real, right?
Yeah.
And monsters don't have fangs and horns. They look like human beings.
The worst part is they not only take your body over and put their own morals in,
Or invest, create their own person.
yeah, they make you forget, so they're not liable whatsoever. It's not just you're a soldier, it's like you're a sleeper soldier. Like, this is like high level evil bullshit.
Oh, it that understates how horrible it is, right? And to call it evil, you wish there was a word that was darker and more notorious and nasty than evil. Evil, because evil's not enough to sum up what these fuckers did, right? Fuck them. I'm sorry, like it's hard for me. It's really hard for me not to be charged and want to say nasty shit, right? So which I will refrain from doing. So the only reason anybody discovered that it existed was because of whistleblowers, right? A particular whistleblower. All right, so we're going to talk about him just briefly, right? So his name was John Marks, and he recalled that there was a records in a warehouse, and they were financial records from the beginning of the program from 1952 until it ended. So the possible end was like around, they were saying around 1973. So, because remember, the congressional hearings were happening in 71 and then became part of the public light in 74. So, that means they acted to mitigate how much blowback there would be, and their answer was to destroy all the records. So, but because this guy, who was a former State Department officer, he recalled that there were these records in a warehouse, and they were only financial records. It proved beyond any reasonable doubt that this program existed, and the start and possible end of the program. So we know definitively, emphatically, that it absolutely existed, and they absolutely conducted these actions, right? So the financial records showed how much they spent, the equipment they bought, leases, buildings they rented, spaces they used, but it was nothing about the content of the experimentation. So what they were specifically doing is the thing that's missing, right? That's the stuff that was destroyed, because that would have been the most damning thing. Like, because now they can argue, well, yeah, so what existed? It was a program. It was an acknowledged program. It was. Remember, it's not like they were flying under the radar. It was a program that was endorsed by the Central Intelligence Agency. So anyway, so it's John Marks. He testifies at these Congress hearings for Seymour Hersch to expose it, and he wrote the first book about MKUltra in the late 70s called The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, the CIA, and Mind Control. So I would highly recommend, if you're kind of curious, to both these books that we're talking about now that we brought this one. The Search for the Manchurian Candidate and the CIA and Mind Control by John Marks. So we all know, we've all heard the expression the Manchurian Candidate, right? So it's essentially an asset that they refer to, that were the objectives of MKUltra. This idea that you could take somebody and you could create a separate identity, and that identity would be your tool to carry out whatever actions you deemed, and they could program them. So imagine what they would have to do. So remember what they said, the combination was the use of drugs, hypnotism, and other methods to break a person's will, and then to break them to the point where now you create a split in their psyche. So now that there's two personalities existing, and it's so devious that the primary personality is completely unaware of the secondary one, and so has no knowledge of what the secondary personality does. Perfect Patsy, right? So anyway, so Uh, so so Marx tells of the explosive story of the CIA's highly secret program of experiments in mind control. Uh, his curiosity was aroused by information on puzzling suicides. That's what started it for him. He had like people dying, and he just found it unusual. And Marx worked from thousands of pages of newly released documents at that time, as well as interviews and behavioral studies, producing a book that accomplished what the two Senate committees could not get. So that Senator Edward Kelly. So remember when they had in the early 70s. So at the beginning of the decade, they were trying to get these guys to out these guys, and they're beyond the fact that that this program existed. They couldn't get anything out of them, right? And so he managed to good research towards the end of the decade was able to like a combination between what psychiatrists were talking about and research that was going on at the time, was able to piece together all these puzzling kind of suicides and present a picture that was like, here, this potentially is what they were doing, and it for all intents and purposes they seemed quite successful at it, right? So so I want to mention now Seymour Myron Cy Hersch. He's an American investigative journalist and a political writer. So Hersch first gained recognition in 1969 for exposing the My Lai massacre. Are you aware of the My Lai massacre? So in Vietnam, I believe it was 200 villagers were massacred by a platoon, American platoon, it was they were eventually outed for having done it, right? And so Vietnam was an enormous black eye on the Americans. So I grew up in the post-Vietnam era. So like, being a young person in the 80s, we were really aware of everything that was going on with the Vietnam veterans, and My Lai was actually something we covered in history class, because believe it or not, we studied the Vietnam conflict, right, to try and understand like exactly what went on. And we did it from an interesting perspective because we didn't adopt the American perspective. It was a much more objective kind of view of the entire Vietnam experience. Now, having said that, at that time, culturally, tons of movies, Platoon, Hamburger Hill, all movies about the Vietnam experience, and we were, as a young person, we were totally sucked in, totally sucked in. So anyway, so Seymour Hersch, so he was one of, he was recognized for exposing this massacre and the cover-up during the Vietnam War, for which he received a Pulitzer Prize in 1970 for investigating research, right, investigative international reporting. So during the 70s, Hersch covered the Watergate scandal from New York Times and revealed the clandestine bombing of Cambodia. In 2004, he reported on the U.S. military's mistreatment of detainees at Abu Ghraib prison. He was also won 2 National Magazine Awards and 5 George Polk Awards. In 2004, he received a George Orwell Award. Investigative reporter Seymour Hersch was one of the first to reveal the extent of domestic spying by the Central Intelligence Agency since the 1950s. So how much they've been like looking into, Americans, right? And enemies foreign and abroad, right? And at home. So Hersch was had accused the Obama administration for lying about the events surrounding the death of Osama bin Laden, disputed Osama bin Laden, and disputed the claim that the Assad regime used chemical weapons on civilians in the Syrian civil war. Both assertions have stirred controversy. So he's not a guy without controversy, but he was part of that entire period, and in the attempts to expose the information, right? So after he wrote the book with John Marks and spoke publicly and toured, had a small tour, like public speaking tour, and he retreated into obscurity, and he would never do an interview again till in the 2000s, when Tom O'Neill would approach him when he had told him about the West files that he had found at the UCLA at the warehouse. Remember I was telling you, because he was the head there. So he ended up, that's where he found the letters that corresponds between Gottlieb and West, right?
I want to see what's on that list of like things they bought so badly. Cause
well, it would be super benign. It would just be like, addresses. No, I don't think you would recognize it as being anything substantial. It just lists of equipment and like desks and chairs and filing cabinets. Like it'd be benign stuff, like the stuff you would need for if you're going to set up an office somewhere, that sort of thing. Oh, you need examination tables, you need examination lights, maybe like an X-ray machine, stuff like that. Right, an ECG, like electroencephalocardiogram, like stuff like this, stuff that you would expect associated with any kind of like medical research and stuff. So I think it was lists of that sort of thing. Remember, no content. The only damning correspondence was that between Gottlieb and West, and them saying that we need to broaden like what we're doing in terms of our experimentation, take it out into the field. Take it out in the field. Well, then they set up the brothels and stuff like that, and dose people, and then to see what exactly how they behave and that sort of thing. So 30 years of research, they must have accumulated so much data that they probably made discoveries about the human psyche that they had to deny because they couldn't go public with it, right? Because then it would lead to too many questions. And now it's research that, at least on the surface, appears to be completely lost to us. But again, I wouldn't be surprised one bit to discover that it's in private hands, or that it moved out of the intelligence community and now exists somewhere else, in some other institution, right? But I'm not making any claims one way or the other. I'm not saying that they did,
but it's a reasonable stance to take. Cause
I don't think it's a stretch, right?
Yeah, they at least want to promote the same kind of line of thinking that led to they're trying to resist torture. Not only was that war,
it made sense, like in terms of what initiated it, but there's no way that was and we know that for certain that wasn't the focus. The focus changed after 4 years. So after 4 years they started going, well, here the objective now is to like, can we create unwitting assassins? Like,
so they must have found some within.
So clearly they did. They must have made some discoveries about, well, if you're able to fracture an individual and then integrate a separate personality or identity that's unbeknownst to the primary identity, and that you can trigger when you require it using I'm not smart enough to presume to know what they would use as triggers, but it'd probably be something super random, like safe word, right?
Oh, the Hollywood cliche safe word.
Or something, or it could even be like, oh, this beautiful blonde in a red dress with polka dots. So it's not even a word; it's just something you see. Yeah. You see this beautiful blonde walking down the street in a polka dot red dress, and suddenly you're going like, ding. The second personality emerges and suppresses the primary personality. The primary personality thinks it's asleep. It has no awareness that it's not present. And now the secondary personality is free to carry out whatever orders or whatever function it's required. So super scary stuff, man.
Yeah,
that's
especially when you can use any cue.
Damn it, man. It's the creepiest shit you'd ever imagine. So anyway, getting back to John Marks real quickly. So he stopped talking about this stuff, and it wasn't because of like he was threatened by the intelligence community. He stopped doing this because people started showing up at his home, going, "Hey, I think I might have been a victim of MK Ultra." He couldn't go anywhere anymore because people would start popping out of the woodwork saying, "I think I might have been a victim of MK Ultra." And he goes, "I'm not. Not only am I not prepared to deal with this, I wouldn't even presume to know how to deal with this." So that's why he, like, after his book, because his book was probably sold. I'm gonna go on a limb and assume that his book sold really well. That's why he retreated. from it. He was like, I don't need this. I don't need to wake up and have people camping out on my, hey, help me. I was a victim of MK Ultra. So can you imagine, people coming out of the woodwork? That would be absolutely terrifying, right? So anyway, so part of the way that they would do what they were doing is that they do these drug tests on prisoners, hospital patients, Johns, hippies. People had no idea this was going on for 25 years. So they were freely experimenting on essentially anybody. And remember, it was once they had the realization that they could do the things they were doing in a laboratory environment, that's why they moved it out into the real world, because they were like, we could maybe even, I'm going to assume that what they discover is that even on demand, they could create one of these agents, an unwitting agent, right? They could just do it with virtually anybody. You subject them to the right kind of like techniques, drugs, and hypnosis, and boom, you got your trigger man, right? Or so again, super, super frightening. So because he was a recognized authority, he had never given an interview. Then after that, he was like, okay, I can't deal with this stuff, right? But then Tom O'Neill approached him in the 2000s and said, here, look at all the data I've accumulated. And remember, now Tom's book was it was about this secret history of the 60s and Charles Manson and the CIA and stuff. So it overlaps with this guy's book about MK Ultra and the CIA. So we know that all these guilty bastards they literally got away with murder. Who says you can't get away with murder, right? Where's Batman now, right? So what was really being done? So this is what the problem, or the question: how much did they do, and how far did they go? There are barely any records of that. We only know that they were doing it, and it took 20 years of research for Tom O'Neill to write his book, like to accumulate that, what little evidence there is to accumulate that. So the guy did the yeoman's work, man. Like, the guy busted his ass, and he produced this. It's a really damning document. Now again, it implies a lot, but it can't definitively say it, because it can't definitively prove one way or the other that that there was something going on with MK Ultra and Charles Manson and West. Although all those things, the synchronicity, the occurrence was just too unusual. But you go like, that's not proof, right?
Right, and people can reason that it's all made up, because you consider somebody who does murder people. Guess what they're going to say? I didn't do it. I know it.
Of course. Why would they confess to it, right? So anyway, so what Tom O'Neill did was he actually tracked down some of the grad students who were working in the clinics, because they were using university students. Remember, it's not like they had evil scientists. They were all evil scientists. You had grad students who were just trying to get credits. And so these grad students that he interacted with, they kind of outed to a degree what was going on, because they knew but they just thought, like, here, like, this is way above our heads. We're just doing as we're told. So they were, and
oh, that sounds familiar.
Well, but to be fair, they're like, they're finishing up university. They need these credits, so they go work at these clinics, and then they're like, here, we deal with hippies and all this stuff. So we want you to, like, grow your hair out, grow shaggy beards, wear jeans when you come into work. Right, so you could justify that by going like, here, we're just, you want to make the people that we're actually treating in the clinic feel like they're not being ostracized, or right. So
yeah, that's a great thing, especially when you're helping them.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but they knew something was going. They were suspicious, but they were kept in the dark.
right.
So, but here's what it was, why it was suspicious. They were encouraged to use things like LSD and because they were administering some of these drugs to the clinic patients, right? But they were doing it because they're, they go, okay, so go into this room. There's somebody in there. Just give them, 30 cc's of this or whatever, and then that's what they would do, right? Like, because they're students. They're just doing. They're going, oh, it's just part of the job, right? So West was there recruiting the subjects. Now West, while he was there that summer, had opened something called the Haight-Ashbury Project. And in correspondence and papers found that they called the laboratory disguised as a hippie crash pad. So remember the safe houses that were brothels? They would also create fake hippie crash pads, right? Where it'd be like, just basically a place where squatters would go, but they'd rent it. So it's not like there wasn't being paid for, but they'd leave the door open and be a place where like hippies could go and squat. And then what are they doing? That's where they would grab subjects for their experiments, right? So it's just like the Operation Midnight Climax, safe houses, the brothels, the bordellos, all tricked. So they trick out these places to look like communal hippie crash pads. I had 6 graduate students, and all of them were pretty frank about what their participation, but they were all kind of leery too, because there's no statute of limitations on murder. So if someone died as a result of what they were doing, they could, at least legally, be held liable. So you could appreciate their trepidation and maybe the fact that they might be hesitant to like be completely forthcoming. But they apparently shared like their journals and stuff like that with Tom O'Neill, the researcher, who wrote the book. So they ran that in the summer of '67, and West was getting people from the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic on Clayton Street, sending them around the corner, Frederick Street, to participate in dosing and getting them, like, seeing if they would be, because I'm assuming part of the process was them to determine. I bet you they can't do it to everybody, so you need a very particular type of person for them to be able to carry out whatever they were doing in terms of the brainwashing and mind control. That there's some people who are completely resistant to it, and so that all you'd be doing is getting them super high. And it'd be the kind of guy that you go like, okay, we're trying to create a new personality. So there's, dosing with LSD, and they're talking about creating, whatever method they would use, and the person would go, hey man, what are you talking about? Leave me alone.
Stop flashing those lights.
Yeah. Okay, no, next. So, and these diaries, they were revealing in terms of like what they were doing in terms of their day-to-day, what they were doing, so that they do know that this stuff was going on. And like I said, remember, they were encouraged to participate in that hippie culture, not just to appear like one, but here, dig in, like,
I think showing their journals is at least one way of them clearing their conscience.
Yeah, I would agree.
I wouldn't say that everybody's evil, like you said.
Yeah, no, the majority of people are just,
they're
just people. And what they want to live relatively good lives. They don't want to see other people suffer. They don't want to be the reason why somebody suffers. But they're not the ones that will burn the world or set the world on fire. It's that small minority that thinks it's their right to do, well, essentially whatever they want to do. Right?
And those university students, sad thing is they're younger people. They're a little bit more pliable when it comes to pressure and authority.
Right. Because they're going, hey, like, we're supposed to trust them. Like,
yeah, don't question everything. For God's sake, don't question anything.
No. Question everything.
Oh, yeah.
So, anyway, so then now we get to see now, like, the kind of picture that this West guy, like, he and Gottlieb essentially did horrible shit to human beings. There's a specific case of a guy, and I don't want to get into it because it's actually really, really horrible. But we're gonna just discuss it briefly, and then we're gonna close this out. there are letters between West and Gottlieb running the program describing how they were going to do it and hide it from their colleagues. Like, because remember, a lot of this stuff was being done on university campuses, right? And there was Canadian universities that were participating in it. So they were smart. They had, like, it wasn't centralized. It was spread out, and it was spread out all over the country. Well, actually, in 2 countries, and it was a safe way for them to be able to maintain. To keep prying eyes away from what might be really going on, right? And so they pool, and what they would do, like any good researcher, they pool all the research and then make their conclusions based on the entirety of the research. When West started at Lackland Air Force Base, he was running the psychiatry department at the hospital. I'm not sure if it's this would be Gottlieb in '52, and they were running experiments on prisoners and human subjects. And one letter, Gottlieb, he says eventually we'll have to take the experiments out into the field. There was one serviceman who was suffering horrible headaches. So, and he was referred to the program that was being run at the McLaughlin Air Force Base. I don't know if I got that right. It doesn't matter. But so anyway, this guy agreed to the program, and so he would regularly show up for treatments, sort of thing, under the assumption that he's getting treated for these severe headaches. And what ends up happening is that in that summer, it's unusually hot time of year. So it's an unusually hot summer, and families were outside late at night, and a particular family had their children in the parking lot of a bar that they were hanging out in. So again, I'm like, it started with a bad idea, and then one of the children go missing, and then this serviceman. So once they realized that one of the children had missing, I want to stay away from the details of this. It's pretty gruesome, so I don't want to share it. But beyond the fact that, to make this long story short, so this guy, so while they're in the midst of searching for this missing child, that evening, two of the local sheriffs come across this serviceman coming out of the woods, and he's covered in scratch marks. There's blood on him. Within a day, they discover the child's body. He was taken immediately to the base, and then he's charged for the murder of this child. And this individual had no recollection of what had happened. And then in his defense during his trial, his own wife and mother spoke about how that he was getting treated for these horrendous headaches, and that he had zero recollection of the events that led to this child's death, when he was clearly guilty, because I believe that he had DNA evidence that condemned him. So you had this poor guy who was one of Gottlieb's fucking experiments, right? So you destroyed this man's life. They actually destroyed one life completely, second life, the majority of them, and then everyone affiliated with them, and that motherfucker got away with it. A piece of shit. So Sidney Gottlieb got off easy, so did that Joylyn West. These motherfuckers who, with how they could conduct themselves with guilt-free of their actions. It just speaks to monsters are not scary creatures. They're fucking human beings. Not all should be clear. Not all human beings are like that. Most people genuinely just want to live good lives and want to help each other. Those are the people we should focus on. But we should always keep an eye out for those dirty motherfuckers, the ones that would do this horrendous shit and then look at you and smile. They're the real monsters, right? So, again, you never want to be somebody like that. it's to say it's sad and disturbing and unsettling, again, understates how horrible it really is. Okay, so having said that, can I get a time check?
It's 1:14 right now.
Okay, so I think, do you have any kind of any closing comments you'd like to make with regards to this? Like I said, I'm sure MK Ultra is a super fascinating subject, but once you start getting into the weeds and getting into the nitty gritty of it, what little there is, it, it's scary. It's terrible.
Yeah, I'm kind of furious hearing about that last part.
Yeah,
Because you think about that. They take your body, they make you act against your own moral judgment. This guy walks out of the woods in front of cops,
and
revealing himself covered in blood, going, I don't know what happened.
and he and the reality is he probably didn't. So
They made him at least murder somebody.
Right.
That's fucked.
Right. So his primary personality and identity didn't, as far as he's concerned, had no part in it. And in a manner of speaking, that's kind of true. It's this supplanted personality that's guilty of it. It's the and his material body that was the active participant in the vehicle that allowed for it to happen. So maybe this then does speak to our identities. How real are they? Are you really your identity? Right? The thing that you, or your personality, what you acknowledge as being you. It's a question for you, perhaps for you to explore and to ask yourself. Right? How real is your idea of you? And remember, most of us walk through this world trying to be who we think other people think that they want us to be, who we think we might be, who we think we are. So if it sounds confusing, super is, right? So all it means is that we have a vision, us individually, an expectation of what we think other people expect of us, and then we try to live up to that vision, that expectation. And your personality is a part of that. Now, for most of us, we have a moral compass. We conduct ourselves in a way where you can feel guilt-free because you're not exploiting or using other people to your own ends. Which is, I'm surprised by how, because in a small way, people will kind of do that, like when it's convenient. Right? So it becomes a thing of convenience, friendships of convenience, until you no longer require them, and then smell you later, right? So our personality, so it's a fair question. How real are they? And only you can answer that. Anybody listening to this, you have to decide, how real is it? I would argue that it's not very real. It doesn't mean that it's not valuable, because it's a reference point. So, and if it's done right, it becomes this beautiful work of art. But even as a beautiful work of art, is it real? And I think that you could make a compelling argument that says, especially in light of this information, that it's not. That somebody can create another identity or personality within an individual, and that one doesn't function with any kind of restrictions or any kind of moral compass. They just do as they're told. So then what are you really, if not the essence of who you are? So you're not your personality. You're the awareness, the consciousness, the energy, however you would like to describe it. You're that thing, that driving force that's intangible, that exists within each and every one of us and drives each and every one of us. Right? So that's maybe what you really are, and your identity is this mask. It's a facade that we put on, and when it's done right, it can be beautiful. It can be very artful, unique expression of who you are. But I don't know that it's more valuable than the essence that drives you. And maybe instead of cultivating that personality all the time, maybe you have a direct connection or direct experience with the essence of who you are, right? that more fine, intangible energy, life force, essence, quintessence, however you would like to describe it. Right? Any thoughts? Something you'd like to add?
If we know how pliable people are, like their psyche, it just goes to show that you can change it yourself. You can go out there and change yourself.
So maybe that's the positive takeaway from all this. So then maybe in exploring who you are, and then you, as you say, that you can realize a higher expression of yourself. Because remember, as a result of MK Ultra, they demonstrated the lowest expression of what you could be. It's basically an organic automaton, like a robot. But the highest expression of what you are is probably something more closer to something, I don't know, I'll use the word divine.
Hopefully resilient.
Well, way more resilient. Can you imagine what a fully realized human being would probably present almost as though they were limitless? You would maybe use descriptors as supernatural, superhuman to describe them, which wouldn't be accurate, because it's not that they're being superhuman. It's the extreme limits of what a human can be. The upper extreme maybe is even an inappropriate word. The upper limits of what you can be. So maybe it speaks to the value then of living a life, trying to not just express but realize those upper limits of what it is that you are, right? Because the alternative is you can dive into despair and become the worst example of what it is that you could be. And so the choice becomes a personal choice. What would you want to be, right? These poor bastards never had a choice. They were victims. But how many of us are not victims? We'll never be victims. And yet we'll walk through life like we are. So here, maybe the takeaway from all of this is, as you say, that there's nothing that you can't be. So then, one, maybe should try to be everything that you can be, and two, the quality of what you can be should be the highest quality and the highest expression of what you're capable of being. Maybe that's where the real value is. Maybe that's what will produce a more saner world, and not allow for people like Joylyn West and Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, right? That's how you avoid those kind of individuals. You have a culture and a society where people try to fully realize who they are, and then how else would they be other than a force of good, right? An expression of that. So maybe that's something maybe that's the note to end this all on. So I would just like to say then, in closing, unless you have something you'd like to say.
No.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, perhaps it's a sound position to question everything. Question everything. And aspire to become and to be, from moment to moment, a renegade individualist, humanist, critical, objective thinker. Thank you for your time. Have a great night. Love you all.